Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. My name is Katie Nichols. Very excited to be joined in a few moments by Karl Scheuerman and Jason Wood of CrowdStrike. Thank you for joining us today. Really excited to have you back. If this is your returning star webcast attendee, if it's your first time, welcome. If you have any questions during the webcast, feel free to type those into the questions panel. We'll get those to as many of those questions as we possibly can. So please ask questions of our presenters. This webcast is being recorded. That's a common question we get. So you'll be able to find that recording as well as a PDF copy of the slides after our broadcast, and you can get to that from the page where you registered for the webcast. All right, so that's our logistical stuff for the day. Let's dive right in. Here's our plan for the SANS Threat Analysis Rundown. Here's what we want to accomplish with this webcast series. Trying to bring you different voices and different perspectives on cyber threats. So you'll recall we started out a couple of months ago talking about industrial control systems. We've talked about coronavirus-related threats. And today we're going to be diving in with our two presenters to eCrime, and specifically targeted eCrime, and how do we hunt for those adversaries. And as always, we want you to be able to take action on what you learn in the webcast. So our plan for today, we'll give you a rundown of a couple things that have been going on in recent weeks you might want to be aware of. Then we're going to have Karl and Jason give you a deep dive into our topic of the day, and we'll wrap up with some key takeaways for you as we end the webcast. Let's get started, as we often do, with a rundown. This is just meant to be some of the key things that I've heard people talk about recently. Of course, the top of the list, ransomware. I feel like not a day or a week goes by when we don't hear about a new high-profile ransomware incident, whether it's REvil, known as Sonokibi, or Maze with that compromise of Cognizant, or compromise of that major package delivery firm, or the Texas Department of Transportation. I think it's pretty clear that ransomware is not going anywhere. So for all of you, I hope that you're thinking about how you protect your organizations against it. Luckily, Karl and Jason are going to be touching on ransomware a little bit in their presentation later on, but be watching these adversaries, Maze in particular, really vocal about who they're compromising. So I think that this is something that is going to stay for a little while. Be prepared in your organizations. How are you going to handle ransomware? We talked in previous month about coronavirus COVID-19 themed targeting, and definitely seen a continuation there. Both on the kind of criminal side as well as I think the state-sponsored side. And this isn't limited to any one country either. We noted there was an article on Iran-associated targeting of a drug maker. The UK government said that their universities and research institutions were being targeted. A Chinese research firm came out saying they were being targeted. In the US, DHS and FBI released a joint statement saying that Chinese actors were targeting US institutions. So a lot of folks trying to get that leg up on advantages when it comes to coronavirus research. So another theme that we've seen. I don't think that one's going to stop either. Another interesting note I wanted to point out, we've seen a couple reports in the past few weeks on malware targeting air-gapped systems. So we have links to those references at the end of the slides. Trend Micro put out the report on USB Ferry, and then ESET put out a report on malware called Ramsey. I thought this was interesting because we don't often hear a ton about malware targeting air-gapped systems, and in thinking why that is, ESET had a great line in their blog post noting that, well, maybe it's somewhat of a visibility gap or visibility bias. Always we need to be thinking about, what data can we even see, and maybe because there aren't as many air-gapped systems that we all have visibility into, maybe not as much reporting coming out about malware targeting air-gapped systems, but if that's something that affects you or is likely to affect you based on your threat model, definitely check out those blog posts. Last but not least, ending on a positive note, a long-awaited Verizon data breach investigations report dropped last week, so I'm excited about that. I've just started diving in, but if you haven't checked that out, great work to Gabe and Alex and the whole Verizon team. It's always a fun time of year when the DBER comes out because we get to see trending across the community, not just one organization, but what are the trends we're seeing across the entire community. Just a couple things to check out, and as I mentioned, we have references at the end of the slides. If any of those stories interest you, maybe you missed those. All right, moving on, let's move on to our deep dive portion of our webcast. So Really pleased to introduce two awesome analysts that I know, Karl Scheuerman and Jason Wood from CrowdStrike. They're going to be talking to you about the rise of targeted e-crime and how this is something that you shouldn't be overlooking. So Jason, Karl, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Katie. Hello, everyone, and thank you for giving Jason and I a chance to share with you here today. We're happy to be here to discuss threat hunting and some details about the significant growth in targeted e-crime activity we've observed over the past year plus. Jason and I both work at CrowdStrike on our managed threat hunting team called OverWatch, where we do threat hunting as a service to a large number of customers. And as we get started here, we should also make an important point that the findings and insights we're sharing here today are not necessarily something that Jason and I can take sole credit for by any means. Rather, this presentation reflects the contributions of an entire threat hunting team who we are truly privileged to work with at CrowdStrike. All right, we'll get started here with some brief introductions so you guys know a little bit more about our backgrounds as we present to you today. I've been in the intelligence and cybersecurity field for a little over a decade now. Started in the military side of things, and I now have been at CrowdStrike for going on 5 years. During my entire tenure at CrowdStrike, I've been on Overwatch for that whole time as a threat hunter and a part of our Overwatch service. I also still serve in a part-time capacity with the Air National Guard as the Director of Operations for a Cyber Intelligence Squadron up in Washington State.
Hi everybody, my name is Jason Wood. I'm a senior researcher here on Overwatch, and I have been in technology for quite some time. Started out as a systems administrator, and I've just kind of worked my way to security because that was where I was interested. Spent time working on defense, doing penetration testing, teaching, and now doing threat hunting here at CrowdStrike, where I've been here for a little over a year and a half now, and the entire time has been on the Overwatch team.
Excellent. So for our agenda today, we will begin by talking about those e-crime trends that we've mentioned before and give some further detail on what exactly we have seen related to that. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time actually diving into case studies, picking apart a few examples of those targeted e-crime related intrusions and honing in on how threat hunting really played a key role in uncovering those attacks early on so that they were able to be disrupted and thwarted. And then we will conclude with some final considerations from that threat hunting perspective as you look to defend yourselves against the rise in targeted e-crime that we're seeing out in the wild today. Okay, to start, what you see here in this chart is a demonstration of the relative frequency we've observed between different threat types. On our Overwatch threat hunting team, of course, we see all types of the noisy, low-level commodity threats that are out there in the wild, but we don't necessarily focus on that. Our mission in our threat hunting is to hunt for those targeted, sophisticated adversaries who have bypassed existing security technologies sitting in your environment and instead are performing those hands-on keyboard intrusion attempts. We work to find them as quickly as possible to disrupt their activity before they have any real impact. So we hunt for any type of threat that may be employing those types of targeted tactics, regardless of their motive. Could be criminal or state-sponsored espionage, whatever it may be. And we, of course, keep track of those targeted intrusions that we uncover. So this chart here is reflecting those trends over the past year. Obviously, the relative rise in targeted e-crime is significant here over that time period. And that's driven by a number of factors. We lay out those factors quite extensively in our annual CrowdStrike Global Threat Report, which was just released a couple of months ago, so you can go there for some more details there. But just briefly here in short, e-crime adversaries are increasingly evolving to adopt more targeted approaches to their attacks as they realize the profit for large-scale potential profit payout is significant when it comes to targeted e-crime ransomware attacks, something that we also refer to as big game hunting. And that really is far outpacing nowadays what we've seen in years past. We're seeing e-crime actors use more extortion also now as part of those big game hunting attacks and data leaks to increase the likelihood of those ransom payouts. So this is all driving this growing trend. As a quick side note, the Verizon DBIR that Katie just mentioned earlier was that was recently released. It had pretty similar findings in their breakdown of the rate of e-crime versus state-sponsored breaches over the past year, that being 70, 30, 80, 20 in comparison when you look at targeted attacks in the wild over the past year. So given that targeted e-crime is obviously such an issue these days, we're hoping that by sharing some examples from our experience here today in successfully using threat hunting to disrupt these actors will help further equip you to do the same.
All right, so we're going to, from here, dive into our first case study of an intrusion that OverWatch discovered. And this is from an adversary that we call Indirect Spider. And you're going to hear a lot about spiders today because of the way our Intel team breaks up the different adversary groups and tracks them. So inside of CrowdStrike terms, a spider is eCrime. So you're going to see various named spiders as well as unidentified spiders today. And this one was kind of interesting, I think, because of a number of things. One, the initial vector and what the adversary got access to was really interesting to me as I was analyzing this intrusion. Essentially, the adversary somehow got the victim to go on to, I assume, a malicious site, because underneath Internet Explorer, we start to see WScript being executed against what was named some kind of JavaScript file. From that JavaScript file, it called WScript against it. I'm assuming it wasn't actually JavaScript, that it was doing something else. Possibly, but regardless, dropping out of that was a PowerShell command with an encoded, base64 encoded payload. We'll take a look on the next slide what that payload decoded to, but essentially what it gave the adversary was a reverse command shell to that victim system, and it's running as, you know, in the context of that user's permissions on the host. From there, we saw the squibbly-do attack take place, basically running reg server 32 to pull down a remote resource and execute some scriptlets on that was contained in that payload on the host. We saw reconnaissance commands being run to gather up information about the host system itself. And then all of a sudden we saw a number of WMIC commands being executed where the adversary was moving laterally, and they were calling them directly. And what I thought was interesting about that, potentially they had some information about the environment already, because I didn't see any host discovery commands, and yet I saw the lateral movement being done by name. So we saw a number of things here that we could use to hunt on. One is just the idea of unusual process trees. It's not really common to see WScript being executed underneath iExplorer.exe. And so that caught our attention. And then to see that sideways movement using WScript rather. And then we saw that sideways movement using WMIC. That also was interesting to us. So those are some of the things that our threat hunters got a hold of with this. Was, I think, the lead that brought them to this was just the unusual process trees here being run, and seeing that, and then being followed up by a reverse command shell using PowerShell. Now this is decoded. What you saw in the payload, or what we saw actually, was PowerShell.exe, execute this in a hidden window and decode this blob of base64 encoded text, and this is what it decoded down to. And a couple of things jumped out to me here right away. First off, they called a remote system by the IP address, and they also addressed to port 110. Now, we actually saw a number of base64 encoded commands being run, and one of the things I saw that varied was this remote port they were going to would vary a little bit. But this activity all took place under port TCP 110. Basically, POP3 is what that's normally used for. The organization must be allowing POP3 out. Allowed the adversary to get their command shell on the victim system. And then I saw this prompt down here below where it's sending back basically a PowerShell prompt. It's running inside the PowerShell process. At this point, the adversary can run whatever they want to using PowerShell.exe as long as this user has permissions to run it. And so this is also something we pay attention to. You got to be a little bit careful with base64 encoded PowerShell because I've seen a lot of legitimate execution like that. Some folks will look at that and say, well, it's obviously malicious because why would anybody execute a script that way? But I see, build systems like Chocolatey using that type of functionality pretty commonly. But in this case, we see, obviously malicious activity.
Okay, this next case study we'll look at involved the attempted deployment of Dharma ransomware. Dharma actually is by far the most prevalent type of ransomware we see used in targeted ransomware attacks today. We observed numerous attempts by criminal actors to gain access to victim networks to install ransomware, of course, as part of these targeted eCrime attacks. And when we do so, the initial intrusion vector that we see most often falls into one of two categories. The first avenue typically is exploiting vulnerable externally facing servers, and the second most common we see is brute forcing publicly exposed SMB or RDP surfaces through password spraying. And so this case in particular, it was actually the latter. The adversary was able to get on through RDP, and when they landed on the machine after their password spraying attack, they had access actually to an administrative account in doing so. So we in OverWatch identified the initial interactive behavior when the adversary had landed and they executed a collection of malicious scripts using that administrator account. And so that collection of scripts actually performed a number of different tasks, and that burst, so to speak, of activity, of those changes happening on the system really caught our eyes quickly. A few things that we saw this scripting do is actually a script that composed a number of different changes and had scripts embedded within it. But we saw things like querying the operating system for different permission groups and actually modifying passwords for existing local accounts. They added new user accounts. They manipulated the file system permissions to hide aspects and directories associated with the newly added accounts. And they added they hid the newly added accounts from the view of the initial logon screen. So lots of account manipulation activity happening. But then they also made other changes to the system itself. They modified the registry settings so that it disabled timeout settings for their RDP session, because obviously if you're in the middle of an RDP session trying to make changes and trying to escalate what you need to move laterally and deploy your ransomware, you don't want that RDP session to time out on you. So they made that type of a change. And then they ran another script, a CMD script that created a new service called Windows System. So a little bit of trying to blend in and maybe hide there. But then that new service was created to execute a ransomware payload that they actually named payload.exe. And that turned out to be their Dharma payload. Similarly, they also had one other script named log.bat that was used to clear operating system logs. So even though they created this service named Windows System, they're still deploying ransomware payloads called payload.exe and clearing logs with a log.bat script. This is loud, this sort of stuff is obvious. So at this point, it's pretty clear you start seeing some divergence in typical TTPs associated with this type of an eCrime actor, as opposed to maybe a state-sponsored or another actor who's trying to be more quiet and subtle in what they're doing. These guys aren't caring so much about blending in, being quiet, low and slow, stay undetected for as long as possible. They understand that They just need to act quickly and get that ransomware deployed as soon as possible, and then they're going to be able to accomplish their objectives. They don't need to stick around forever and go undetected. So that's a big change, and as a threat hunter, that makes our jobs a little bit easier because they are somewhat more obvious in the fact that they're not trying to be as subtle in what they're doing. So that's one key takeaway there. And but as such, threat hunting with speed here is absolutely critical, because you need to uncover this stuff quickly and make sure your responders are adequately equipped with this type of detail very soon, so that you can respond appropriately before they lock down your network. So moving back here into the details of this attack, shortly after they created that new service, they attempted to execute with that service the Dharma ransomware payload, but the activity was blocked by the endpoint security software. And so in response, the threat actor then did some troubleshooting. They downloaded Process Hacker, the Process Hacker utility, and used that to try and debug the failed attempts to execute the ransomware. And the threat actor also then used Process Hacker to try and unhook installed security software and try to even manipulate some of the native operating system features to try and get around the security implementations in place, but they were ultimately unsuccessful in doing so. So here we often see targeted crime actors using these types of tools like Process Hacker or also PC Hunter, Gamur, these publicly available utilities that allow them to perform defense evasion and bypass security software installed on the targets. So it's absolutely essential that you hunt for those types of things, for the presence of those types of utilities on your network, particularly on hosts where they shouldn't exist, or if they haven't existed before, all of a sudden you start seeing them. Those simple tools, just looking for something that basic, can pay dividends for you as a threat hunter. It's also essential that your endpoint security software is sufficiently hardened to prevent it from being easily uninstalled by these types of tools. So if you have the ability to password protect the install of that piece of software, make sure the settings, everything's configured properly to harden your security software as much as possible, because these adversaries are becoming more cognizant of those things being present and wanting to try and turn them off so they can succeed in executing their ransomware attack. Finally, in closing here, if you do want more information on not just this attack, but several of the trends that we're seeing in Dharma ransomware targeted attacks in general, then we have that blog that was recently published that's linked here. And again, these slides should be available in PDF form after the presentation.
All right, next up is an adversary that we affectionately know as Pinchy Spider, which for some reason that name makes me laugh every time I see it, and I get a kick out of it. Pinchy Spider is kind of an interesting adversary. One of the things that I find to be really fascinating as you look at these adversary groups is how they interact with one another, and really kind of an ecosystem that goes on with eCrime activity and the actor groups that conduct that or facilitate it. Karl mentioned the global threat report already. There were a couple of pages in there where our intel team documented how the different adversary groups, what they provided to other people, what operations they conducted and stuff like that. And I really dug digging into that. Pinchy Spider is interesting to me because not only do they perform ransomware activity, they provide ransomware as a service to somehow validated affiliates, if you will. So not only are they out actively ransoming people's environments and stuff like that, they're providing it in all the ransomware and updates to it and stuff like that, as well as all the infrastructure needed to conduct ransomware operations to other people. So as you can imagine, we see these guys fairly regularly because of their affiliate base. And we tend to group them all up underneath Pinchy Spider, even though it may be an affiliate, and we just track affiliates as we go. These are the guys, actually, this is the group that's behind the REvil ransomware. That they used to be running what was called GandCrab, and they announced, hey, we're getting rid of this and we're done with it, and the reason why they were done with it is they were releasing REvil. This particular intrusion is kind of typical for Pinchy Spider. It sounds actually pretty similar to the Dharma attack that Karl just discussed. Just a couple other things I wanted to point out. They also got in via RDP that was exposed to the internet, and they did that via password spraying. Password spraying is the idea we have a large dictionary of users and a small dictionary of passwords trying to stay underneath that account lockout threshold. And they're just trying to find one account, or see how many accounts they can get that let them onto the system or get that initial foothold. This is where you see things like Spring 2020 exclamation point being used in attacks. That password, I can tell you from when I was doing penetration testing, that type of scheme works pretty well when you spray it across an entire user base. Regardless, the actor gets onto the system. We had this indicator here of the password spraying occurring, and then a burst of suspicious commands happening on the system. They log in and immediately launch the command prompt, start downloading some tools and scripts to the system, and then they kick off their first script, which is this batch file here called del space service.bat. And when I first saw this, I thought they were deleting their service.bat script, but then I realized actually they had a space in the name. And what you saw was the script was just going through and stopping every service that it could think of that might be on the host. You see here 2 entries for QuickBooks of varying versions. I think when I counted, there were like 50 different versions of QuickBooks, different net stop commands trying to lock up any QuickBook installs that are on here. They're killing database software like MySQL or MS SQL, stopping IIS. The idea here is they're wanting to get the operating system and the running processes to release their hold on the files that they're using that contain the actual data that's important to the organization. The reason why they want to do that, obviously, is so that with the lock released, they can now encrypt the files and ransom the data. And one thing that's interesting to note here, obviously, is everything in here that I saw in the net stop commands or the task kills was going after something that was important to a business. If you are coming up towards the end of the month and your QuickBooks gets locked up, you're very likely to pay that ransom because you need to get that back so you can do your billing and stuff like that. For example, this attack was kind of interesting. Karl mentioned in the last one where the adversary stopped and was doing troubleshooting as they went. And I kind of got a chuckle out of this intrusion because they actually dropped some programs onto the system to enable them to stop or try and interfere with security tools. And so they dropped PC Hunter, for example, on the system. And as I was looking at it, they tried to run it a few times, like 2 or 3 times, and it kept getting blocked. And a lot of times you'll see adversaries start troubleshooting and trying to figure out what's going on. This particular individual, and it is a person, that's one thing to keep in mind, this is a person on the keyboard doing this, decided, to heck with it. I'm just gonna move on. And they kicked off their script to delete or to stop all of the services and kill processes. And they didn't do any troubleshooting. It's like they just doing step 1, 2, 3, and then, okay, we're gonna move on. After this script ran, they tried to launch their ransomware on the host. Fortunately, when they launched PC Hunter, that was blocked. They tried to launch their ransomware afterwards. That was blocked. And what I thought was interesting is they just kind of shrugged their shoulders and gave up and moved on from there. So some of these adversary groups, they'll get on the system, they'll get hands on the keyboard. They have, sometimes a pretty good level of access, but they're there to do one thing, and this guy just didn't care, it seemed like. They had a number of other groups prepared to go on the system to do things like to delete volume shadow copies and clear log files and stuff like that. This person didn't do that at all. They just left their stuff there and just disconnected and went away. For hunting, you want to keep an eye out for password spraying. That's that idea of, brute force attack. And certainly if you see a number of failed logins and then somebody suddenly successfully logs in over RDP, be very, very concerned. Look for bursts of suspicious commands or unusual commands paired together in a very short period of time. And obviously we always want to watch for services being halted, and this would be something that probably just regular system uptime monitoring would have picked up on. But we also need to be aware of that. And as Karl said, this happens really fast. This was kind of a smash and grab, if you will, of activity. And they didn't care about how noisy they were or anything like that. They just wanted to get it done quickly. And we need to be prepared to move quickly as well, because once that data is locked up, we need to have a good way of recovery or we are in trouble.
Okay, this next case highlights the dangers posed by improperly secured, publicly accessible server applications. And it also highlights the importance of 24/7, 365 threat hunting, because this particular attack we're going to talk about next happened in the middle of the night on a Sunday morning. And this is often, far more often than not, particularly for attacks targeting US-based organizations. More often than not, those attacks are going to happen in the middle of the night and often on a weekend. And there's a few reasons for that. And this is true for both eCrime and state-sponsored espionage types of targeting. But of course, it makes sense that those adversaries are going to want to target organizations when their perceived defenses are lowest. So when staffing could be lowest, that being in the middle of the night or on a weekend. But also that a lot of these adversaries are operating from locations overseas, and so it's only natural for them to be doing things during the day for them. And when it's daylight for them, daytime hours, it's often night hours here in the United States. So for all these reasons, 24/7, 365, continuous threat hunting, having that constant visibility, hunting across your network, even at all times, all hours of the day, is so critical. So in this particular attack, even though it was in the middle of the night, we were able to initially see, as we had hunters on queue during that time, that they were, we saw execution of several discovery commands performed in short succession. So you have this burst of discovery activity. Jason and I have already talked, repeatedly about the importance of, when you're threat hunting, looking for those bursts of several unusual, maybe in and of themselves. A who am I command by itself is going to be very high false positive rate for as an atomic hunting lead, and so maybe you wouldn't anchor just on that. But if who am I is being executed in the same short period of time as several other discovery type of commands, then that should bubble up the priority for that sort of behavior happening for you as a hunter to dive further into. So in any case, here we see several discovery commands executed in short succession, but also performed as grandchild processes under an IAS worker process. What's happening here on the SharePoint server. We saw things like net user commands, net group commands, domain trust discovery, things like that happening. So it's a somewhat suspicious process tree in and of itself, and then you have these discovery commands happening within that short period of time. Yeah, that certainly gets our attention, and we want to dive further into what's happening there. And then shortly thereafter, we saw obfuscated PowerShell commands that were simply employing the from base64 string method. And a lot of PowerShell uses base64 encoding, and for lots of legitimate reasons, but also adversaries like to use that as well. So in and of itself, that's another example of, as a hunting lead, that could lead to a lot of false positives, but you combine that with some other suspicious behaviors that you may be looking for as a hunter, and that can pay some dividends. And that really has been a great hunting lead for us, so believe it or not. And so that happened here as well. And then we saw the adversary shortly thereafter, then testing connectivity to adversary controlled, an unusual domain that we suspected at the time, and later confirmed that sure enough, it was an adversary controlled infrastructure they were using for C2. As we started analyzing that obfuscated PowerShell command, it turned out to be a PowerShell shellcode loader that they were trying to use to deploy a CrowdStrike payload to additional hosts on the network boundary, other IAS servers, OWA servers at that given target customer. And the DNS traffic, the domain lookups that we were initially seeing when we looked into that further, turns out those were DNS TXT queries, which are consistent with CrowdStrike's communication that can be configured to use DNS TXT records for C2. So certainly all this is adding up to malicious activity happening that responders need to address in rapid fashion. As we continued to hunt and uncover and watch what the adversary was doing, we saw them employ WMI and PowerShell to retrieve a likely malicious file from a pastebin site, a pastebin URL. And then they pivoted to several additional hosts using WMI, using a valid authenticated account to do so. And then they executed a malicious batch file on those other systems. We don't know at that point how they got exactly that valid account, but we saw them doing it. And as threat hunters, that's a key point where you may not necessarily know how an adversary got to a certain point, but nevertheless, you can pull on those threads and make sure that you are delivering your findings as quickly as possible to responders so that issues can be quickly responded to minimize any potential impact that this attack may inflict. So I mentioned the batch file that they use to deploy to other systems. That batch file actually ended up installing a malicious service named Backup LAN, and you can see the command here on the page that details the creation of the establishment of that malicious service. It was configured to execute a payload named dmx.txt, and when the registry for these target machines was modified to create this service via this persistence mechanism, then we saw the target machines run a command to forcibly reboot the systems into safe mode. And rebooting systems into safe mode is something that ransomware does sometimes as an attempt to bypass antivirus security solutions that would otherwise block the system if it wasn't running in safe mode. So you run the system, you reboot into safe mode, and then you have a better chance of getting your ransomware to execute because potentially some security settings would not be available to block it. And then after rebooting, the infected machines would then run that dmx.txt payload, which was found to be a version of a script from the PowerShell Empire framework. And ultimately that script, after a series of events, executed an encoded PE file using the invoke reflective PE injection function of PowerShell. And OverWatch then observed commands to delete volume shadow copies. And at this point, you know for sure, even though we ourselves at that point hadn't reversed any of the artifacts related to this, already you can see through the chain of commands, you can have a very high confidence as a threat hunter that something related to a targeted ransomware attack is happening here. We may not know the exact type of ransomware at this point, but you know enough to enable defenders to take action. And indeed, subsequent analysis of the artifacts involved here did confirm for us that the malicious PowerShell script had dropped a payload of Medusa Locker ransomware. So based on these TTPs and that C2 infrastructure we had noted earlier that was involved here, CrowdStrike Intelligence ended up attributing this attack to Anthropoid Spider, another targeted eCrime type of adversary. Overall here, this case is also a good example of the importance of using threat hunting as an integral part of an overall defense in-depth strategy. Threat hunting itself isn't a silver bullet, it's part of what needs to be a comprehensive strategy. As demonstrated here, threat hunting allows you to uncover the presence of an adversary very quickly, even a criminal one like this trying to move quickly themselves, which of course is essential in a big game hunting targeted ransomware attack for their purposes. But when you combine that quality threat hunting with an effective endpoint security solution that can block execution of tricky malicious files like what you see here, then you have a winning strategy that can disrupt an adversary at multiple stages of their attempted attack. The reason the adversary in this particular example was able to get so far in the attack was because the endpoint security platform being used here for this targeted victim wasn't configured to enable blocking. It was only set to alert and detect. It wasn't actually set and configured to block. So this is a good reminder here that if you have all your settings properly enabled, or if that you need to have all your settings properly enabled to take full advantage of their features. So that is key. Use the benefits of the platforms, the technologies, the capabilities that you have to their full extent, because these adversaries are very intent on doing everything they can to achieve their objectives. So we need to be as ready as possible. So if you have the ability to block something with your technology, please use it. And now we have this is our last case study example. And here, in this case, we in OverWatch uncovered some unusual behavior stemming from a running service host process on a Windows domain controller at this particular organization. What happened here was a suspicious reflectively loaded DLL was launched and leveraged that service host process, and specifically the net services group, to execute and connect to a suspected adversary controlled domain. So here we see another, not just reflective loading of a DLL in service host, but then we saw a connection, a request for a domain that was unusual for this organization. So there's a couple hunting leads that allow us to suspect something suspicious, if not malicious, is occurring here. And then within minutes, we identified an interactive command shell spawned under that service host process. So at this point, we have several strong indications that something malicious is happening here, likely an implant running on the system. So that command shell did, in fact, lead to interactive hands-on execution of various host and network discovery commands that we suspect were likely preparations for possible lateral movement. They're running things like net view commands, domain trust discovery, DNS zone enumeration, and so on. Later, the adversary returned again and attempted to execute, at that point, an unknown PowerShell script that they were pulling from a remote server. So that example you see there, them running PowerShell, they're actually trying to pull down further scripts that then they tried to execute, but the execution of those scripts they were retrieving remotely failed. And they failed because of the endpoint security prevention settings. So these folks, good on them, they had prevention settings properly enabled and configured. So as a result, the actors then attempted to perform some troubleshooting to diagnose why things weren't working, why they weren't getting their commands to execute. So as a threat hunter, this is a case where this is a time where you enjoy some fruits of your labor. This is those enjoyable moments where you get to see the adversary struggle and fumble about. And in this case, to perform their troubleshooting, they ran a few commands. You can see examples here. They ran some WMI to do some process investigation on that service host process that they were leveraging for their implant, and also running some taskless command, trying to figure out what was going on. Ultimately, they gave up, and they've yet to successfully return to this victim organization. When we analyzed the C2 infrastructure used here, along in collaboration with our threat intelligence team, they were able to attribute this particular attack to Wizard Spider, which I think has maybe been touched on earlier, but if not, Wizard Spider is the adversary who's associated with Ryuk ransomware, and they are known for demanding some of the largest, if not the largest, ransomware demands in the wild today. So very much a big player on the targeted eCrime landscape. In summary here, when you're employing effective endpoint security, you integrate that threat intelligence, you have proactive threat hunting, we absolutely can disrupt these adversary attacks before they become costly breaches.
All right, so just to kind of wrap up what we've been talking about, some key points throughout this presentation. One, keep in mind that targeted eCrime adversaries, they're going to use what's built into the operating system as much as possible. Or they're going to use, if they're going to drop some stuff down, they're going to use tools that are known to be legitimate in use in general. We'll see a lot of stuff like PSExec or process proc dump, or sysinternal tools and things like that, things that have some legitimate purpose for systems administrators. And They do this for a couple reasons. One, the tools work really well and they're stable, but two, by using good tools or things that are built into the operating system, it decreases the likelihood that the defenders are going to detect them early on in their intrusion. So we want to be aware of that and build some of our threat hunting practices around that idea of looking for those unusual type of executions of those tools. We want to focus in our threat hunting on bursts of activity that are unusual, things happening in a rapid or a short time window. Karl mentioned the idea of a bunch of reconnaissance commands suddenly being executed closely next to each other, what's going on there, to start looking at that. Obviously, we're going to get a lot of false positives that way, but that's what we deal with in threat hunting, right? We're looking around through all kinds of data, and not all of it is going to be malicious, but we do find it that way. You want to watch for unusual process trees, and this comes from knowing a little bit about your organization. There are certainly things that we see as threat hunters that I start looking at and going, oh my goodness, this has got to be malicious. Then you find out that no, this is actually a process that they have inside their organization that's legit. You know, who knew? But you inside of your organization, you'll have that, you know, that knowledge much more readily at hand. So keep an eye out for that. Keep an eye out for what is unusual in your environment. And one of the things I can say from my own experience is it takes a little bit of time to build that understanding of what is normal in your environment using the tools you have to provide the insight that you need. But once you get it, things just start jumping out at you much more readily. So this actually becomes easier than you might think. We also need to build detections that look for that sort of thing. And you know, we've talked about this for years and years on security, but it still applies here in threat hunting, watching out for unusual network activity. Why are we getting port requests for port 110 going out of our environment? Is that normal or is it not? And a key point with threat hunting, if you're getting started in it, it requires a lot of patience. You're going to be looking through a lot of data. You're going to be learning how, you know, what's normal in your environment. You're going to be almost drowning in it in some ways in data, because our computer systems make so much, have so many events occurring just for normal operations. But as you tune things up and determine what is normal in your environment, you can start to get some efficiencies going. If you stay consistent at it, you'll start to spot the anomalous activity that you can follow up on. And while that can be really frustrating to go through that learning curve, it really pays off when you find something early on and you head off an incident. Because as we know, you know, these breaches are incredibly damaging to organizations. And you know, none of us here want to see that happen to where we work or to anybody else, because you know, we know how rough that is. So threat hunting is absolutely an awesome thing that we recommend. Like Karl said, it is part of the defense in depth strategy. We don't recommend threat hunting as your sole, you know, defensive strategy. It's just one more layer in there with all of your network controls and endpoint controls, as well as this last little bit looking for the adversary to be hands-on on the keyboard. And with that, let's go ahead and open it to y'all. Do we have any questions?
All right. Thank you so much, Karl, Jason. Awesome stuff. Like a lot of things that I'm mulling over a little bit here, the idea of looking for unusual process trees, trying to know what's normal in your environment to find the bad stuff. Not an easy task. So got a couple questions coming in. Feel free to type your questions that you have into that questions panel. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Luckily, we got a few minutes. I'm excited to pick your brains. So we got a question asking about the spider name. So for those who might have joined late, could you review what does spider mean? Why is it applied to kind of operators behind ransomware? And got also clarification on, is our evil under Pinchy spider? So could you explain the spider thing for folks?
Sure, Karl, I'll go ahead and take that one since I talked about both of those. So yes, our evil is Pinchy Spider. That's their tool. They maintain it. and distribute it via their ransomware as a service platform, as well as conduct their operations. So as soon as we see that, we start getting early, as soon as we see our evil, we start to think Pinchy spider. As far as the spiders and why do we use that term, spider is CrowdStrike's intel team breaks up adversary groups kind of either what they're doing, their purpose, or where they're located. So we'll have spiders are eCrime. Another group that we have for hacktivists, for example, they fall underneath the Jackal family. And then we give individual names to those, and then we have names for different nation states, which we didn't really talk about today, but Russians fall underneath bears because historically that's the Russian bear is what everybody refers to. So yeah, spiders are just our eCrime adversaries, and as soon as we discern that they're looking for eCrime, some kind of criminal profit motive, that's where they tend to get grouped. Good question, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Always tough, I think, for any team to try to cluster together activity and look for patterns. So good to hear a little bit about your approach to that. I've got a question about trending in recent months. This is something that I've kind of picked other people's brains on. We talked about in a previous STAR webcast. In terms of trending around coronavirus COVID-19, have you seen over the past few months any kind of patterns, an uptick, a downtick in activity, maybe more eCrime, any kind of trends in the past few months that you could comment on there?
Yeah, I'll take this one, Jason. We indeed have seen an uptick in, when we looked at this as being a possibility early on, after COVID-19 started spreading, we suspected this could be a possibility. So we started looking at our data, and we looked in particular at the number of targeted attacks, be they eCrime or state-sponsored, against any healthcare organization. And that's the approach we took for that analysis. Now, I think it's been widely reported. We already knew that all sorts of adversaries going after all sorts of industry verticals were using COVID-19 type of phishing lures to give themselves footholds into different organizations. So that's out there. We know that's been well reported. But we wanted to look in particular about if healthcare organizations, the ones actually providing the critical support to respond to the health crisis, if they were being increasingly targeted. And sure enough, there was relative to the year prior, we did see actually certainly an uptick in the number of attacks and the rate of targeted attacks against healthcare organizations. So what we did is we put together a blog on that, which you get, and it provides all those details. So it's easy to find. Just Google CrowdStrike blog, healthcare targeting, something to that effect. You'll find it pretty easily. And so our OverWatch threat hunting team actually took some time we talked some about the trends, and we also gave details similar to what we did here, of course, but they were with different scenarios, different types of attacks that were actually going after healthcare organizations. Most of those were eCrime in motive. We had some also that were unknown. We didn't say a whole lot about potential for state-sponsored targeting there, just because we wanted to be cautious. We wanted to get our information out and make sure defenders were enabled. But subsequently, it's been pretty widely reported, I think, elsewhere, that even state-sponsored adversaries have used that as a motive or have used their tactics to in fact target state-sponsored organizations. A lot of industrial espionage, perhaps targeting medical research institutions in hopes of finding information perhaps related to treatments for COVID-19, all that stuff. A lot of that stuff's been publicly out there, but we can, from firsthand knowledge, definitely have seen an uptick in healthcare attacks. I encourage you guys to check out that blog for those details.
Awesome. Thanks for recommending that, Karl. We can also paste that into the chat if you can find it real quickly as we roll on with our lots of other questions coming in. A lot of them are around how do you do threat hunting? So we got a question about how should a SEM play a role? How should like an EDR play a role? So could you talk a little bit about, maybe on your team or other teams you've talked to as you're trying to do threat hunting? Like what kind of tools and data do you find useful?
Sure, I'll go ahead and give my take on that. One of the things so obviously CrowdStrike is an endpoint detection focused organization because that's, the Falcon platform is endpoint detection. So that's what we're seeing. I come from a background where I was focused pretty heavily on network. and a lot of the same ideas kind of apply to it, but you get different, obviously very different telemetry. I find it, one of the things I found amazing when I came on as a threat hunter was the amount of information that we had on the endpoint, and the ability to see, like the unusual process trees I talked earlier about, going from iExplorer to WScript to PowerShell, reverse command shell, and then all of the commands that they were running from there. It was absolutely amazing to me to have that access to all that data. The problem is, of course, you have a lot of data and you kind of drown in it. So you need to, it's a bit of a process. You start casting out kind of a wide net to figure out what you have that's, what's the normal noise level or things that are occurring inside of your organization. What I would really recommend people do is to pick an area to focus on that they want to start to understand. Rather than try and understand everything all at once, pick an area you want to gain a greater understanding inside of your organization, be that changes occurring on host, commands that are run, or unusual network activity, or just network activity is all, and getting a profile of that, and start to focus in on that and see if you spot anything there that is off, that doesn't look right. And you're going to find things that don't look right and actually turn out that they were intended, oddly enough. But you add that to your knowledge about what the organization does and how the environment functions. So, and then as you get a handle on that, you can expand your scope wider. And then obviously along the way, you can toss in things like I mentioned, looking for bursts of activity. If you have that type of data on endpoint, then you can start to put in maybe some queries into your SIM for commands reconnaissance looking commands being executed in a short period of time. And yeah, they'll be a little static, but it still gets you some information, and you can fine tune and adjust over time. So that's kind of some things that I would look at. Karl, do you have anything to add there?
No, I think that's good. One other thing potentially to consider is you could review any time you learn about a new intrusion that occurred, be it from some industry blog post or industry threat reporting. We put out mid-year and annual public reports too. You can go through and review details of intrusions that are publicly reported, and then ask yourself, hey, if I was a threat hunter, would I have been able to uncover this with the telemetry I have, with the data I have, with the behavioral detection implementations that I have in place, and then go forth and use that also as a lead to understand how you can build up your threat hunting capabilities. That way you're going to be able to threat hunt not just for theoretical attacks that could occur, but stuff that's actually happening out in the wild, because this is in fact what is happening out there. So that may be another avenue for you to pursue to build up and begin engaging more in that threat hunting space.
Yeah, Karl, you were speaking my language, like base your threat hunts on what real adversaries are doing. So you all provided tons of TTPs and info throughout this presentation. So, I think what I hear you saying is this isn't easy, but kind of getting to know your environment, starting with maybe a single hypothesis based on what adversaries have done. To answer some of the tool questions, sounds like, yeah, absolutely a SEM can be useful for writing these queries if you have EDR. But I know a lot of folks who are using, Windows Log, Sysmon, a lot of those resources as well. And we don't have time, sadly, to get into the host versus network debate. But I'm going to say I think that throughout you've shown examples of how you've identified malicious activity with both host-based and network-based artifacts. So with that, bunch of questions coming in. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time to answer all of them. But as Karl and Jason mentioned, lots of great resources from the CrowdStrike OverWatch team. The mid-year report, annual reports, they address a lot of different TTPs, adversary activity, and I believe some hunting ideas as well. All right, with that, we're starting to near the end of the hour. It went by so quickly. So as we start to wrap up here, just a couple takeaways and some action items. I loved how Karl and Jason, really started off the presentation talking about state-sponsored versus eCrime and how they've seen a huge rise in eCrime activity. And so I would just advise that, state-sponsored adversaries, depending on your threat model, your organization might matter a lot, but don't overlook targeted eCrime. Jason and Karl have given you a ton of different TTPs today, so the slides will be available on the registration page. Go back and take a look. Do you have data? Do you have endpoint data, network data, where you could find some of these TTPs? Maybe take something from a slide, see if it's in your environment, and iterate from there. And as Jason and Karl emphasized, try to mitigate as early as possible. That's a tough thing, but I think we all are trying to get left of boom. If you identify those adversaries, hands-on keyboard in the middle of the night, like some of the examples, trying to block them, kick them out as early as you can. And we talked about ransomware throughout this webcast. Have a plan in place. How could you potentially mitigate that or respond to it if mitigation isn't possible? So just a couple things for you to think about, some go-do items as we wrap up here. With that, a bunch of references for you to read more. We also pasted that CrowdStrike blog link into the chat for you if you're interested in reading more there. And with that, that's our hour. Thank you all so much for coming. Hope you enjoyed. As we mentioned, these slides in PDF format, as well as the recording of this webcast, will be available. Thank you again to Karl Scheuerman and Jason Wood from CrowdStrike for presenting. And with that, that's all we have. Thank you all so much for coming. Please stay well, and we hope to see you at a future webcast.